Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Planning for the Recovery, episode 6. This is the last one this summer, and we're very glad that you can join us before we take a break for the summer holidays. I'm joined by the normal panel, and so I'm just going to get everybody to introduce themselves. If they could say who they are and where they are, and whether they had any alcohol last night. Starting with you, Jack.
I'm Jack Smythe. I'm in our chambers in Birmingham, and I consumed no alcohol yesterday evening.
Thea?
Yes, Thea Osman-Smith, hello, joining from home in Shropshire. And yes, I went out for a meal with my lovely friend Lisa, who's an NHS worker, so we celebrated her with a bottle of wine.
Very good. James?
Chris, hello. Still here in Westminster, central London. No alcohol last night. Barristers never drink.
That's so true. And Leanne?
Well, James, I'm afraid you're wrong. Barristers do drink, and I was one of them last night with a certain Silk and our lovely client. I'm in the heart of the Ebbsfleet Garden City development at the moment. Absolutely lovely. Can see lots of development work going on around me.
Yes, we're doing an inquiry, Leanne, aren't we? And but we've got a day off because our opponent is in the Court of Appeal, so we get a day off, and that's why we are able to do this today. And so I'm just going to give a brief overview about what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about permitted development rights, which are obviously being changed very significantly right now. And we've got lots to talk about, the upward expansion, the temporary uses and so on. And people want to know how they're going to operate in practice and what needs to be done. So that's the first main topic. And the second topic is the issue of zoning and what that is actually going to look like, because we believe that is coming. That is what the government wishes to do. And the two issues are not wholly unrelated as well. So without further ado, I should just say that on Tuesday, the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development England Amendment Number 3 Order 2020 was laid before Parliament, and the new rules come into force at 10 a.m. on the 1st of August. That means that full planning applications will not be required to demolish and rebuild unused buildings, as homes and commercial and retail properties can quickly be repurposed to help revive high streets and town centres, which we all know is desperately important. Homeowners will be able to add 2 stories to their additional homes to create new homes and more living space for growing families through a fast-track approval system, but with a requirement still to carefully consider the impact on neighbours. And that all comes on the same day as the government commissioned review on housing delivery through permitted development rights concluded there were developments which are of worse quality than schemes which are allowed through traditional planning permission routes. And we all know about the example of flats that have been allowed without any windows, which is just frankly ridiculous. So that's where we start with. And we're going to look at permitted development rights. First of all, Jack, you're going to look at some permitted development rights that came into force in June. These are temporary uses, is that right?
Yes, that's right, Chris. So from the 1st of July until the end of this year, you may use any land for any purpose for no more than 28 days, of which no more than 14 days may be for the holding of a market or for motor racing. In undertaking that use, you are permitted to cite any movable structure for that purpose. So this appears to be a broad and generous extension to the PD regime, which also applies to conservation areas, but it is constrained. So firstly, the use of land for the display of an advertisement is explicitly excluded. It doesn't apply to land within the curtilage of a listed building or a caravan site. And in respect of land which falls within a SSSI, motor racing, clay pigeon shooting, and any war game is excluded.
Well, that sounds like an eclectic mix, but what does that mean in practice, Jack?
Well, it seems to me, Chris, that this is a green light, a bright green light from government for businesses to make use of outdoor space in order to square the circle of providing social distance as well as maintaining the viability of those businesses. So we can expect to see restaurants, shops and pubs recreating their premises outdoors to the extent that space allows, through the erection of marquees and also setting up outdoor seating areas. Car parking spaces are likely to disappear and can be redeployed. In answer to the question which came in from Gail Collins, I see no reason why pubs cannot convert their car parks into outdoor drinking areas with marquee bars.
Okay, and what about holding markets?
Yeah, the new class allows the use of any land as long as it doesn't lie within a SSSI for holding a market by or on behalf of the local authority for any purpose up until the 23rd of March next year. So what is this likely to mean in practice? Well, first, the liberalisation of markets, so they need not be confined to particular days of the week. And secondly, it seems to me that this opening up is likely to encourage the diversification of market provision. So we've all become accustomed to the range of products available at most typical town markets and the fancy stuff available at farmers' markets in the more salubrious parts of the country. But might we also see some people who've been laid off and tempted to start their own businesses, selling their products online and also at these markets? And might we also see conventional shops, which have traditionally shunned markets, making use of this option?
Jack, there are also some provisions, aren't there, relating to natural light. Can you tell us about those?
Yes, Chris, the changes relate to the residential conversion in respect of Class M, so that's retail shops, food takeaways, betting shops and so on. Class N, including amusement arcades and casinos. Class O, offices, which will have a particular interest, I suspect, to our audience. Light industrial, and also our old friend Class Q, agricultural buildings. These changes come into effect on the 1st of August, and in respect of offices, the old PD right did not grant the right to do any work, such as the creation of new external windows or doors. And as you've mentioned, Chris, this hasn't deterred some developers from converting existing office blocks into windowless dwellings, which has led to a whole rash of rather garish tabloid headlines about the creation of new 21st century slums. So in response to this criticism, the government has amended Class O so that now prior approval by the local authority includes consideration of the adequacy of natural light in all habitable rooms in the new homes. So if the conversion would result in insufficient natural light in any habitable room, the planning authority must refuse the prior approval application. What's habitable rooms? These are defined as any rooms used or intended to be used for sleeping or living, which are not solely used for cooking purposes, but does not include bath or toilet facilities, service rooms, corridors, laundry rooms, hallways, or utility rooms. So effectively, we're talking about bedrooms and living room.
Okay. How will that work in practice, do you think?
Well, I think in practice, the applicant will have to submit detailed floor plans indicating the dimensions and proposed use of each building in order to identify which rooms are habitable rooms, and the position and dimensions of windows, doors and walls, and the elevation of each home. The elevations of each homes. It's then for the planning judgment of the council as to whether the floor plans betray adequate light in the habitable rooms. How does one decide whether the light is adequate? This is plainly highly subjective and will be case sensitive. One can easily imagine different officers reaching different judgments on very similar schemes. It is a recipe for unpredictable decision making, and I suspect that some cautious councils may ask for daylight assessments to provide reassurance. But it does seem to me that there is scope for imaginative means to satisfy the adequate light requirements without installing windows, such as the use of sun pipes and borrowed light. Provided these make way for meaningful natural light, I see no reason why these should not permissibly satisfy the requirement. The requirement for adequate light does not mean direct sunlight.
Okay, very interesting, Jack, and some very interesting observations there about the daylight, actually. It's obviously been a big issue, concerned the government, and they've looked at this carefully. Great, terrific. Now, thank you very much for that. And now we go to Leanne. And Leanne, you're going to talk about the new permitted development rights which come into force in August, and that's for the construction of new dwelling houses on detached blocks of flats. Is that right?
That's exactly right, Chris. And of course, we first had, I think I'm right in saying, we first had an announcement of plans to build upwards all the way back in March 2018. And of course, then subsequent to that, the Planning for the Future document that we saw in relation to more details that the government wanted to put into play in relation to building upwards. And we knew that that was coming summer this year. The regulations that deal with flats in particular are the Town Country Planning, Permitted Development, Miscellaneous Amendments, England Coronavirus Regulations 2020, easy for you to say. And that amends the GPDO and gives a permanent permitted development right to allow additional stories to be constructed on existing purpose-built blocks of flats, purpose obviously being to create new homes. Now, it's Regulation 22 of those regulations that brings into play a new Part 20 for the construction of new dwelling houses to Schedule 2 of what we currently have in the GPDO, and it's Class A that introduces, specifically relating to new dwelling houses on detached blocks of flats. So what does that mean? Well, up to 2 additional stories of new dwelling houses has to be immediately above the existing topmost residential story, and it has to be on a building which is a purpose-built detached block of flats. It obviously includes other elements as well, so as you'd expect, engineering operations that are reasonably necessary, works for replacement of existing plant or installing additional plant on the roof where that's necessary to service. Also, things like the construction of an appropriate safe access and egress, which I think is to be expected if you're adding 2 stories onto blocks. Your current access may not be fit for purpose. And then further storage, waste or other ancillary features as well, but provided they are reasonably necessary. Now, as is always the case with PD rights, there are circumstances in which those rights don't apply. You'll find those at A1 to the class. I would obviously suggest that everyone reads this. I'm not going to go through all of them. But some of those you might find interesting are if it's less than 3 stories above ground level, it doesn't apply. If your flats were constructed before the 1st of July 1948 or after the 5th of March of 2018. If you've got a floor to ceiling height of more than 3 metres or more than floor to ceiling of the existing stories, whichever's lesser, and I just add that that's measured internally rather than externally. You've got elements in relation to the height of a roof if it's greater than 7 metres higher than the existing roof. If your extended building would be greater than 30 metres, and then the usual that you'd expect, Chris, so conservation areas, AONB, SSSIs and so on, you're not allowed the PD right in those circumstances. There are also a number of preconditions at A2, and you will need to apply for prior approval, and there's a strict procedure for that you'll see at B within that class.
Okay, now we've been asked, haven't we, about whether the rights only apply to an existing completed detached block of flats, and you've been looking at that as well, haven't you?
Yes, short answer, yes, it does only apply to pre-existing blocks of flats. I know Thea's spoken on this previously in her planning short session. I recommend obviously people go and take a look at that. But there are a number of phrases obviously throughout the regulations that are clearly past tense, purpose-built, existing topmost residential story and so on. But actually it's a lot clearer than that, because in A1, in the circumstance in which it's not permitted, we see there that it has to be built not just before the 1st of July 1948, but not after the 5th of March 2018. So that's your clear answer in relation to that. And if anyone's under any doubt still, there is the explanatory note to the regs and also the explanatory memorandum that details that also.
Okay, and what else is to come in terms of building upwards?
So, put shortly, I've already noted the policy paper, Chris. Tuesday this week as well, the government announced news in relation to other elements of building upwards, including on residential homes. And actually, you noted, Chris, at the outset of today's session, regulations number 3 And that deals with Class ZA, which I think Thea is going to be speaking about. But you've also now got the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development England Amendment number 2 order. I mean, how many orders do we need? Lots, apparently. And that one introduces new rights to allow upwards extension to existing properties of various types. There's 4 classes. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but just to make people aware. This would add to the Part 20 I've just spoken about, a Class AA, which relates to new dwelling houses on detached buildings in commercial or mixed use. Class AB for new dwelling houses on terrace buildings in commercial or mixed use. A Class AC for new dwelling houses on terrace buildings in use of dwelling houses. And finally, a Class AD, new dwelling houses on detached buildings in use as dwelling houses. So significant changes there in relation to building upwards.
Yeah, well, you know what? This all sounds like an awful lot of work for lawyers. There's a great deal of detail in there, and there we will and are already getting questions about how that detail operates. Leanne, thank you very much indeed. It's certainly a complicated area, and thank you for researching all that. Now, Thea, you've been looking at the demolition of buildings and the construction of new dwellings in their place. There's a huge amount of interest in this. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so if you wanted detail, this is the part to go to. This is really kind of detail heavy. So get ready. This is the new Class ZA. It allows you to demolish a single purpose-built detached block of flats and/or a single detached building established for B1 business use. Now, the building must have existed on the 12th of March 2020. You can replace them with a single building that is purpose-built, a purpose-built detached block of flats or a detached dwelling house. So that all seems straightforward, but development is not permitted in a number of instances. So as was foreshadowed, the right cannot be exercised on land that is Article 2.3 land, so that includes conservation areas, AONB, national parks and also World Heritage Sites. The same applies with SSSIs and land within the curtilage of a listed building. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't demolish and rebuild in the setting of a listed building, or indeed the setting of a conservation area, because setting and curtilage, as we know, are 2 different issues. Now, you also can't build on land within the curtilage of a scheduled monument, but that seems like a really odd restriction. The order uses the word curtilage in preference to setting because we see the term curtilage elsewhere. But what is the curtilage of a scheduled monument? Because many of those are often below ground archaeological sites. And curtilage is often defined by a building or buildings and the enclosure around it. So I do wonder what's supposed to be meant by a curtilage around archaeological remains that can't be seen. And I'm sure that's going to be a course of some argument for the lawyers in due course, which we all look forward to, naturally. But here are some of the restrictions. The building to be demolished has to have been constructed before 1989. The footprint can't exceed 1,000 square metres. It can't be taller than 18 metres. It must have been vacant for at least 6 months immediately prior to the application for prior approval. The footprint of the new building has to fall within the footprint of the old building and can't be any closer to the highway. It has to be no more than 18 metres high or no more than 7 metres taller than the old building, whichever is lower. You can have no more than 2 additional stories compared with the old building, and those stories can be no higher than the stories in the old building or 3 metres, again, whichever is lower. Then there are the conditions, and there are a myriad of those too, and they have to be resolved through prior approval. Now, as I said, here we've got an enormous amount of detail to be dealt with. It includes the impact on heritage, archaeology and thankfully design. And I note one of the questions that we've just had is whether these PD rights are divorced from the Build Better, Build Beautiful Commission's work. And certainly I think when it comes to permitted development, there's a real concern over that. And you'll have no doubt seen the report that was published yesterday saying that permitted development is generally of a lesser quality than that which goes through the traditional planning permission route. In terms of this particular permitted development, you do have, as I said, a lot of requirement to provide landscaping schemes and also to outline in detail the design. So hopefully that provides for more synergy between permitted development rights and the Build Better, Build Beautiful. But we'll see about that in due course. Now, if prior approval is given, the development has to be completed within 3 years of the date of approval, and there's no provision for deemed prior approval after the expiry of a certain time, which we see with different permitted development rights. But there is plenty of scope for the local planning authority, I think, to refuse prior approval. So I think that's a recognition of the potential impacts of this sort of permitted development, and that's why that requirement's there.
Can I just ask, do you foresee any issues with those?
Yeah, well, as I said, I was concerned when these permitted development rights were first announced, because permitted development rights bring about speed and simplicity, which is great, but that can be at the cost of good design and delivery of schemes that have wider benefits and are more comprehensive. For example, those which seek to deliver mixed-use schemes and inevitably come with lots of benefits for the local communities. Now, I'm comforted by some of the conditions, but they're so extensive that it does appear to me this is a planning application by another name with significant scope for refusal. So the effort for the developer is almost the same as for a planning application. I don't think it achieves speed or simplicity, and the worst part for communities is that you don't get the goodies that might be secured through the traditional planning permission route, affordable housing being the most obvious, but of course there are lots of others as well.
Yeah, I mean, that affordable housing issue is a significant omission. But I have to say, from what I can see, there's an awful lot of safeguards. The government are calling these permitted development rights, but there's an awful lot of control in there. I think it creates a presumption, really, in favour of this. But don't imagine for 1 minute there isn't a whole myriad of planning hurdles to get through, because a lot of those hurdles that we normally face appear to be there, as far as I can see.
Exactly it, Chris.
Okay, well done to the three of you. It is not the easiest read, and I have to say it is quite an involved process trying to understand all these new rights. There will be cases, there'll be clarifications, as there always are. But for a starter, as to how to navigate that was a seriously impressive assessment. Thank you to all three of you. Now, we're going to move on to zoning, and I'm just going to begin with that, and then James is going to talk about European examples as well. Now, what is zoning? Well, zoning is simply a system whereby everything is regulated largely by statute, largely by legislation, and then it operates to control how development takes place. But the primary intention of zoning is to give much more certainty to developers in particular, but also to communities about what can be allowed. Now, zoning has taken a lot of interest recently. I'm going to hold up a document that has started and stimulated the debate, and this is Planning Anew. And within that, there's a paper by David Rudlin about zoning. He's a proponent of it, thinks it would be very successful. And I've thought the best way to look at this was to speak to those who are actually involved in planning in a zoning system. And one of the most obvious places to look is Australia. Number of reasons for that. First of all, I have a brother who lives in Australia. He's a surveyor, and I just ring him up and ask him how it works. And he's got a slight Australian accent, which I won't replicate for too long. But he explained it's really simple. He lives in an R20. That's an area where 20 houses are allowed per hectare. In rural areas, it drops right down to a much lower figure. And in cities, it goes up. So the centre of Perth is an R80, leaving outside the central business area. And as far as conservation is concerned, that's just a tick in the box, really. You don't have to do much more than that, because what you're allowed to build within the conservation area, and despite the lack of history, Australia does have some conservation areas. Sorry to any Australians watching. They simply follow whatever is permitted within the zone, and there's very tight control over building lines, height, and everything. Now, I've also spoken and communicated with Lottie Wilkinson. Lottie used to work at Hunter Page in Cheltenham. She now lives in Sydney in Australia, and she's been filling me in on how all this works. Now, the thing that strikes me immediately from zoning is that it is heavily regulated by primary legislation. So she's told me about the situation in New South Wales. There's the Environment Planning and Assessment Act in the primary legislation, and the Act is administered by the New South Wales Department of Industry, Planning and Environment, and it allows for plans to be made. So there are still plans, but all of the plans come forward really under a legislative procedure. So the first thing to observe is, if we do move to zoning, which much of the rest of the world does, it's going to be a lengthy process with a lot of legislation, first at the national level, and then we're going to have further legislation for different areas. In Australia, they operate in a federal system with 6 large states or territories. I don't know how that would work here, but you'd have to have individual legislation for each county, potentially. And I have to say, I think, the detail of this is years away. It's all very well to talk about zoning and think it's very simple. But if it's anything like the Australian system, although there are other varieties, it will be an absolute bean feast for lawyers crawling over the legislation and legal challenges. They have a series of different plans. So they have local environmental plans, which are probably the closest thing to our local plans, and they have state environmental planning policies. And one thing that Lottie said is a lot of the individual authorities have different plans that are very different from each other, and sometimes they have overlapping plans. And in New South Wales, the state parliament has decided that there's too much variety and variation and inconsistency, and so they've introduced instruments that indicate that there should be a more regular form of plan. Crucially, though, what zoning is doing is saying, well, this area is for recreational purposes, this area is for industrial purposes, and this area is for housing or retail. Then it's defined. Now, there are attempts to change the zones, and developers often try to do this, but they need the local authority to promote the change, and so there's a big process of persuasion. Lottie's observations are that there's, in terms of the pros, there's certainly a lot of certainty around the process, which she says is good for communities and good for developers. There's a lot of certainty there. The cons are that it takes a long time. Now, bear in mind, Lottie used to work in the English planning system, so she's saying it takes a long time. We need to calibrate that in the context of a system which we know has a long time. And there's a lack of flexibility. So a lot of developers getting frustrated with the lack of flexibility surrounding the way the process works. I honestly think we are some way away. I'll just highlight one other document from the RTPI, and they produced this A3 sheet that identifies how zoning works in a single sheet, and that's well worth having a look at if you want to just understand the basics of the process. Now, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to give us some European examples and talk a bit more about how the system operates there. James.
Chris, thank you very much. I think a good starting point for understanding how zoning works in Europe is that of Germany, and specifically the city of Berlin, which has a very helpful English language website, which I've provided a link to in the chat above. Germany is a federal state, but it's got an overarching planning statute which combines elements of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 in our context and the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004, plus a significant preamble which sets out the objectives which the legislation is trying to achieve, which reads quite similarly to parts of our MPPF. In essence, the German legislation makes provision for two basic types of plan at the municipal level. First, the preparatory land use plan, and secondly, a binding land use plan. Now, I'll just talk about those in turn. First of all, the preparatory land use plan. The preparatory land use plan covers the whole municipal area, and it consists of three parts: a zoning map, which identifies the general types of use permissible within that area using colours and symbols; a written statement, which explains the goals that the plan is trying to achieve, and then a list of modifications to the zoning map. Now, those uses normally fall into four main categories. First, residential. Secondly, industrial and commercial. Third, mixed. And then fourth, special uses such as hospitals. And at the same time, the preparatory land use plan also protects certain areas, for example, forests and open spaces. The municipal authority are required by law to complete a full review of the entire preparatory land use plan every 5 years. And to ensure that this plan is up to date in the interim, applications for modifications are considered roughly twice per year. So if a modification is granted, then the online version of the zoning map is updated. So that's the preparatory land use plan level. Turning then to the binding land use plan, the binding land use plan operates at a more localised level within specific areas in the municipality. In effect, the binding land use plan gives effect to the preparatory land use plan, operating plot by plot, covering key questions such as height, density, setback, and so forth. And the binding land use plan has no technical end date, but when the preparatory land use plan is modified, then it must itself be modified. So the permission procedure is that any individual who wishes to develop a site must apply for a building permit, and it will only be granted where it accords with the binding land use plan. Now, of course, there are multiple further exceptions to this in respect of infrastructure and categories of permitted developments, but obviously there's no time to go into that here. Safe to say that a lot of it obviously resembles the complexity of our own system. As with any mature planning system, there's a strong emphasis on public participation. There is a formal public consultation in various stages when the preparatory land use plan is reviewed every 5 years and when applications for modifications are made, but the final decision ultimately lies with the municipal authority. And the vehicle to challenge a decision made on the plan is primarily through a form of judicial review, administrative law, to the various levels of administrative court. And in practice, the focal point of legal activity litigation in the field is challenges to the process which has been adopted, for example, in respect of environmental assessment or consultation procedures. So, in summary, the German system has three key advantages in my view. First of all, plans are kept reasonably up to date through the fixed 5-year review requirement. Secondly, there's a degree of flexibility to change uses through the modifications process. And thirdly, the system promotes a relative degree of certainty as to what can be brought forward and when. Could this be implemented in England through new legislation? Well, I agree with Chris. It's a theoretically yes, but practically no. The German system has been under development throughout the entire post-war period. And like the UK's 1947 system, it's extremely intricate. It reflects layers of constitutional and administrative law, political, social and cultural trends, and the specific geographical features of that country and the various regions. And above all, there's a strong political consensus supporting its phased, measured and ordered approach. And as matters stand, I cannot see the UK government or the government in respect of England, which is the jurisdiction which this will apply, I cannot see the government being able to bring forward such a comprehensive system. In my view, English zoning, inverted commas, will likely be localised, predominantly urban, and enacted through more through digital advances, for example, interactive maps, than through large-scale legislation changes. So, with those examples, with that particular example in mind, I'll address 4 questions which have been put by our viewers. First of all, Paul Watson from PRW Strategic Advice has asked whether a higher order spatial plan which establishes the principle of and perhaps parameters for development necessary to ensure wider strategic coherence and effectiveness of a plan-led system. So is there a need for a higher order spatial plan? My view is absolutely yes. Most effective, or might say mature zone systems, have a tiered structure with a higher order spatial plan and a lower level plan. There's inevitable variation as to how much level they need to go into, but it needs to have a spatial character. It's not enough for it simply to set out general principles. The difficulty for the English planning system is that a higher order spatial plan will take several years to assemble, only after the legislation has been brought forward by Parliament. So we're not talking here about something that can happen overnight, and we're certainly not talking about something that can work well in adjusting to a severe economic downturn. Now, Robert Persson from DLA has asked, if we were to have blanket national or citywide zoning, who will prepare these detailed documents, and what transitionary procedures may there be for the interim period, which may or not include compensation for unimplemented permissions, local plan allocations that are then washed away in the radical reform? So the answer, in my view, if this theoretical system was to come forward, is that they would have to be prepared by existing local authorities, subject naturally to an allied reform of local government, which perhaps combine more authorities on a county basis, as we've seen in areas such as Buckinghamshire of late. Now, it's possible that government could provide some assistance, and there could be some submission requirements for landowners and occupiers to share the burden. But in practice, at the heart of all zoning systems is the municipal authority, or the local planning authority in our system. And as to compensation, well, the government will be very unwilling to construct a large-scale compensation system, given the current strain on public finances. So I would expect a use it or lose it transition period, in which permission should be built out, or an application made to place those allocations in the forthcoming plan. Third question, Charles Dick of Civic Plan and Design Group asks, what is the significance made for visual and topographical landscape in zoning? Are these not a fundamental reality we should respect as a priority? Now, this is an interesting issue, and zoning systems approach it differently. In the German system, specifically in Berlin, the city has adopted a parallel landscape programme which operates alongside the land use plan. And it's a map which accompanies that land use plan. It assigns particular landscape characters or qualities to individual areas, and it reflects environmental issues, for example, forests and parks, and some heritage designations. So in this way, it sets the parameters which then guide the ultimate binding land use plan. Now, every system's different, but it's important to recognise that zoning does not prevent individual consideration of visual effects and landscape. It simply front loads them to earlier in the process. And finally, Christina Hayek has asked, in what country has a zoning-based planning system worked best? Now, there are a number of ways to address this. In practice, so many countries have zone systems that the best metric would perhaps be quality of life, for example, citizens' overall level of satisfaction with their planning system, and alternatively, conventional economic measurements, so growth, level of investment, and so forth. The countries that I admire are those that have been able to update their national legislation in a comprehensive fashion in the 21st century, in particular the Netherlands and some Scandinavian countries. These countries' political systems are able to have a detailed and sophisticated discussion about how their zoning system should be structured, how it should address complex contemporary issues of public participation, environmental assessment, land value capture, and the transfer of land use rights. And the key thing about any zoning system is that it must not ossify. All the components need to be kept up to date, and that starts with the legislation.
James, thank you very much indeed. I think it's very interesting, and we're all finding it quite interesting to learn a bit more about zoning. But my honest opinion is that the government haven't got a Scooby about what's going on here. They are suggesting it because somebody's come in, some advisor has said, why don't we do this? Or they do this elsewhere in the world. Governments are always looking at how other things are done. But to introduce this system would be incredibly complex. If it is a genuine zoning system, I mean, let's just look at what happened when they tried to introduce the Ldf process. This is the process that came in 2004 through the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act. And we had, obviously, an intention to create core strategies and then a series of daughter documents such as allocation DPDs, area action plans. It all sounded good, but the real consequence of that was a catastrophic failure in plan making to the point where it was almost comically awful, and a catastrophic failure in housing delivery. And by the time we got to the 2012 MPPF, the government had abandoned this two-speed, two-tier system and gone back to local plans, but had caused carnage in the process because, let's be honest, some local authorities, not all, councillors look for excuses not to deliver. So you introduce a new system, and that is exactly what will happen. And I don't think the government has the foggiest idea what they're really talking about when they talk about introducing this. We have probably the best planning system in the world. It is the envy of the world. It is highly sophisticated. We might not like it when we act for developers, James, that there's usually a heritage asset to deal with, and that might put the kibosh on your proposal. But the reality is it's there protecting what is an incredible, historic and beautiful landscape, and making sure that development is done in the right way with all the right safeguards. Zoning is the antithesis of that. It's about a blanket approach. Now, Andrew Whitaker from the Home Builders Federation, Andrew's asked a very interesting question, which I think really gets to the nub of this. Andrew says, could you not modify the development plan process to become a zoning process? And I think that, Andrew, is much more likely to be what we have, not a zoning system that changes all the legislation, because I don't think the government can really mean that. You know, when other countries have been doing it for years, that's fine, but to suddenly import that into our system seems just completely ridiculous. I think what they're talking about is more to do with broad locations, which we already have in the planning system, and saying this part, keeping development plans, keeping the structure of what we've got, but saying this area will be developed. I'm sat right now in Barton Wilmore's offices in Ebbsfleet, and we're in the observatory right above the whole of the Ebbsfleet development. It's a garden settlement, although it was actually just a development that got rebadged when the government decided to have something to say by way of the headline. And you can see the whole area being redeveloped. And I think that that's what they've probably got in mind. And I think, Andrew, you're absolutely right. That is probably a much more likely approach to be taken. I don't know, James, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Chris, I completely agree. The two words that come to mind when I look at the putative zoning proposals are local and digital. What government is trying to do here, I think, is to propose new forms of zoning for very specific areas to drive forward housing growth in those locations. I don't think this is part of a proposal which will seriously interfere with the sort of the sacred totem of the green belt and other protections which are so important to significant parts of the government's current political base. And in respect of digital, well, I think what's really going on here is proposals towards innovation in how we present development plans, development plan documents, how we interact with them. And I think what we're going to see, if there is a planning policy paper in the near future, is certainly some tech wash, some references to significant further investment in how we actually, as professionals and as the public, interact with development plans. There was a question earlier in respect of energy infrastructure. I can answer this offline, but effectively what I didn't go into earlier is there is also a regional component within the German system, and therefore sectoral plans are in place to deal with issues of transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure and so forth, and those are then taken into account within the preparatory land use plan.
And do you think, well, I mean, what sort of timescale do you think, if we do have something, and it is, as Andrew Whitaker says, something that sort of put onto the existing planning system, what sort of timescales before we actually start talking about planning applications being determined within a zone in this country?
Yeah, I think the first question is, if it requires primary legislation, then I wouldn't expect significant work on this before the latter part of next year, and probably kicking into 2022. And the reason for that is because of the deluge of Brexit-related legislation which is going to have to take its place. If, however, they can work to the policy route, and if they can avoid legal challenges on the basis that that policy frustrates the existing statutory scheme, like the West Berkshire challenges, then we could potentially envisage this being introduced at the planning policy and the local level through further documents into, let's say, midway through next year. But again, I just don't think we're talking here about something that's going to be in place by January of next year. I think we're looking at something which is a long-running project which will go into the latter parts of this government's current tenure in power, following obviously the December election. So some way into the mid-2020s.
Yeah, I agree completely. And, that fits in with the government's ambition, tragically ineffective ambition, that we should get to 300,000 by the mid-2020s, which is just so unambitious. It's extraordinary, isn't it? So maybe that will tie in. Anyway, we're all very excited about what's going to happen. We've been told it's this month, so maybe in the next few days that all is revealed. I happen to know that Christopher Kitkowski has been working with a number of others within government. He's the only planning lawyer involved. He can't obviously say what the proposals are, but he says that things are being done at the moment, and we may have an announcement soon. Right, now I'm going to bring back the PD gang, if I can call you that, because we've had lots and lots of questions about permitted development, and we might as well share these with the others. People can see some of these being answered in the chat, but let's deal with fees. Thea, you've been answering some questions on that.
Yeah, just to show that we don't zone out when everyone else is talking. That's Leanne's joke, not mine. I stole it. But we had a question about fees and whether this extension of the PD regime was going to effectively put a greater burden on local authorities dealing with all these applications. So we've had a quick squiz, and I'll call it a quick squiz because we've just been trying to do this while you guys have been talking. But it appears to me, looking at the town and country planning fees for applications, deemed applications, requests and site visits, England Regulations 2012. They're also catchily named, aren't they? That there isn't a change in the fees regime. So Regulation 14 deals with applications under the permitted general permitted development order, and that remains as is. But I think, Leanne, you looked then at the other side of the coin when it comes to fees.
I did. So in the context of the building upwards on flatted development, which I spoke about earlier, so different regulations to the ones Thea was covering. I'm not going to read it all out, but the miscellaneous amendments, coronavirus regs. How many are there? I'll keep saying it. But with those, the government issued an explanatory memo. I can post that link for everybody shortly. And paragraph 12.2 of that says, under the heading impact, the impact on the public sector is a reduction in administrative cost and time of processing planning applications where the development would have come forward through an application. Interestingly, then goes on to say, regulations to set a fee per dwelling, which will reflect the consideration required for a prior approval application compared with a full planning application, will be brought forward at an early opportunity to offset local authorities' costs of considering these applications. So, very clear intention there in that explanatory memo from the government to potentially bring in even more regulations for us to palm over. I haven't seen, and as Thea said, we've had a very quick look at this whilst everyone's been talking, so by no means detailed. Haven't seen any regulations either in draft form or made that deal with that, but certainly one to look out for. I think the current position is, as Thea said, and unless we've missed any updated regulations, but that does, I think, mean that we need to have on our radar the possibility for amendments to fees, and quite understandably, if I might say.
Yeah. I mean, we can understand why that would be the case. Okay. Anything else that anybody? I should just say, if people are wondering where Jack is, he's not just being lazy. we have to really balance these. Well, he had to go off and do a court hearing at 9:45. So doing these webinars is proving increasingly tricky as we get back to normality. Luckily, we've got a break in our inquiry today, Leanne and I, but if it weren't for that, we'd be asking the inspector to delay the inquiry so we could do a webinar, and I don't know how successful that particular application would be. So anything else that anybody wants to raise amongst the team?
So, Chris, we did have another question, actually. We had several in relation to PD rights. Theo and I have been trying to field these the best we can whilst everyone's been speaking, as we've said. But one of them was whether or not for class uses to benefit from the new PD rights, they need to have been previously authorised or established for a certain period of time. Obviously, I'll leave Theo to say what her view is on that. Certainly, in my view, unless any of the exceptions under any of the particular classes stipulate a set period of time, then no. Though I do caveat that with, of course, that the less established the use class, the more there is going to be a risk of argument or an element of debate with the authority over whether or not the use is as described. So you can't simply say, well, I've now changed the use to this class and now I'm going to benefit from PD rights. Obviously, it leaves some scope for work of the likes of us if those arguments ensue, but that's something to bear in mind. Theo, do you have anything to add to that?
Only that, in some cases, of course, the order stipulates when something has to have been in place since a certain time, in terms of, for example, buildings that are to be demolished or buildings that are to be extended upwards. So it's usually there in the order, and if it isn't, then I think you can assume that there isn't such a stipulation. In terms of being able to change use, I think one of the questions was about the Class A change of use, and there's nothing which suggests that the use or the original use has to have been taking place for a certain time period, otherwise it's excluded. But obviously it would have to be lawful, either because it's had a planning permission or because there's a certificate of lawfulness in place. I mean, potentially you could still argue it even if you didn't have either of those things, but you'd still have to start from the basis of a lawful use, and then of course that would be open for argument if the local authority weren't happy with the change that you were making.
Yeah, exactly. More work for us.
More work for us. Yeah, we mustn't complain about that. Just finally, then, on zoning, we've had a comment from Alan Nichols. Good morning, Alan. He says, surely a simple and relatively straightforward way to introduce zoning is to extend the planning permission in principle regime, and on allocated sites the requirement will be just to secure approval of the technical details. I quite agree. I think that may be very well what we see. We already have planning in principle for brownfield sites, but it's very rarely used. I think we're going to see something very similar to that, Alan. I think you hit the nail on the head, which is to effectively amend and modify and make more simple the process we already have. And the link really between these two topics is that although we've seen that the permitted development rights that are being granted are more complicated than some of the ones that have gone before, we are moving, I think, in both directions to a system where they just want to make it much easier to get planning permission and to build and to develop. And make it a lot less complicated. But I think my overall conclusion is that we're going to stick with the system we've got. We're just going to have a lot more freedom. And of course, a big issue tied into Brexit is moving away from environmental impact assessments, because that would be a significant saving of bureaucratic work. But equally, I think the system is still going to be complicated enough to keep us all gainfully employed. So amen to that. Great. Well, thank you very much indeed to everybody for joining us. Just invite all the panel back. I didn't reveal what I was drinking last night, although I should reveal it was red wine. And I think I've done remarkably well this morning in the circumstances. I had yesterday was the culmination of 6 weeks of back-to-back planning inquiries done virtually. And it is exhausting. And I really can't wait till we get back to doing this for real, but the indications are virtual inquiries are still being listed in September and October. So we're going to have this system for a while. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us. Thank you very much to my fellow panellists for the enormous amount of research they've done into these topics, both on zoning and previously development rights. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us. We're going to take a break over the summer. If you'd like us to come back and you'd like us to do more of these sessions and try and fit that round court hearings and inquiries and everything else, then please let us know. Email the team or contact us in one way or another. Let us know what you'd like us to cover. And if there is a demand for it, then we will come back and do some more in September. But that's entirely up to you. We are an on-demand service. Thank you very much indeed. And goodbye from us. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.